What is the scariest true story you know? Part 2. I used to live and work in South Africa with a charity organization, and while there I became friends with a man originally from the Democratic Republic of Congo who was now in South Africa working with our group. Eventually I moved back to Canada, but we still kept in touch sporadically over Facebook. A couple of years went by, and he stopped updating his profile. It was sad, but people move on, and when you are halfway around the world friendships can fade. However, a couple of years after that I was back in South Africa on holiday, and I asked some mutual friends if they knew where he was so we could all meet up and catch up on old times. Unfortunately, all they knew was that he had moved away around the time he stopped updating his profile, and no one knew where he ended up. Another friend and I decided to try to track him down. We got in touch with his family in Kinshasa, Democratic Republic of Congo. They knew he had planned to go to Angola for a job opportunity, but they too had not heard from him in well over a year. Sadly, I could not stay and continue the search, but my other friend did. He found that our friend did make it to Luanda in Angola and was heading toward a town called Luau near the Angola, Democratic Republic of Congo border. This is where the trail went cold, and he disappeared without a trace. No one knows what happened to him. Maybe he fell ill and passed away and was quickly buried somewhere with no one being informed. Maybe he fell victim to foul play. Maybe, in the vast wilderness, he got lost or injured. We will never know. We informed his family of what we found, and they were grateful, but they too have reached closure, believing he is gone. Unfortunately, that is a fate that can befall many itinerant workers, and in many areas of developing countries, there are few resources or willingness to make more than a cursory search, if that. The point is, it is possible for people to disappear even in this day and age. Usually it is the less fortunate, itinerant people, or those in areas too remote or undeveloped to have proper social safety nets to help them. We rarely think of the possibility until it affects us or someone we know, but it is not that hard for us or a loved one to go missing, leaving those who remain never knowing what happened, and that is a scary thought. The USS West Virginia was damaged during the attack on Pearl Harbor, and after the ship was hit the people on board heard banging noises coming from inside. Those sounds were sailors trapped in a compartment. The room could not be opened because water would have rushed in and drowned them, and they could not be rescued from above because the lingering gases there were extremely flammable. When the vessel was salvaged 6 months later, the bodies of 3 men were found, along with empty cans of food and water and a calendar marked from December 7th to December 23rd. They had been trapped for 16 days, likely wondering whether they would ever be rescued before realizing they might not be saved, all while fearing they would drown in the tight compartment. They had to face the certainty of death and the psychological torture that came with it. The story of Jayme Closs is terrifying. In rural Wisconsin last year, a 13 or 14-year-old girl disappeared after her parents had their lives taken in their home. Police arrived within about 4 minutes, but she was already gone. Speculation ranged from abduction to her possible involvement or death. No one knew because she had completely vanished. 88 days later, in the dead of a northern Wisconsin winter, she ran into the street toward a woman walking her dog. She had been held captive about 40 minutes from her home. That alone is frightening, but here is the most chilling part. She had never had any contact with the man who took her family's lives and abducted her. One day he was driving to a new job, where he lasted only a day, and saw her get on the school bus. At that moment he decided he would take her. There was no warning, no grooming. There was absolutely nothing she or her family could have done to prevent it. A creepy young man saw her from about 100 feet away and decided he would take her family's lives and abduct her for himself. My mother works in hospice, which is basically where people are sent to spend their final days as comfortably as possible. Cancer patients and elderly individuals galore there. Anyway, the most unsettling stories I know come from moments when dying patients lose the right to make decisions about their own bodies. Sometimes it is because of Alzheimer's or dementia, which means it is often your children or grandchildren calling the shots for your health. Well, my mother did not stay in hospice long, because a lot of children or grandchildren will selfishly keep their relatives alive for as long as possible. And let me tell you, there is only so much morphine they can give without causing fatal consequences, and the body is capable of dishing out a lot of pain that medication cannot fix. There is also a particularly cruel type of cancer that affects the pain regions of the brain. Truly, there is a reason people advocate for compassionate passing when someone is suffering from a terminal illness. Passing away is natural. Sometimes turning off the machines is the right choice. But when your next of kin feels sad about the idea of you leaving, something that should have taken a few days can be dragged out for years. These patients are not happy or savoring their last days. They are suffering. They beg for more painkillers when they have already reached the maximum dosage. Sometimes they ask to be allowed to go, but you cannot just let nature take its course. This is literally my worst nightmare. I promised my mother that if she ever gets that sick, I will not put her through that, and I am sticking to my promise. Sometimes they stop eating in an attempt to bring about their own end, and then the nurses are forced to insert a feeding tube to keep them alive. In my opinion, this is torture. Please, do not do this to your elders. Do not make them beg for the relief of the end. What radiation poisoning does to you if you are not lucky enough to die quickly is horrifying. The worst case I can think of outside the Chernobyl incident was Hisashi Aoki, a Japanese plant worker who was exposed to a lethal dose of radiation but, thanks to his family and the doctors, was kept alive against his will for 83 goddamn days. A week into his hospital stay he said, "I can't take it anymore. I'm not a guinea pig," yet the doctors pressed on. By the end his white blood cell count had dropped to 0, and the radiation had shredded his DNA. There was no real chance of recovery. There are pictures of him on his hospital bed that, if you have been on the internet long enough, you will recognize from the original, Shocking Images, collection. It looks like something straight out of a torture movie. I sometimes work on the grounds of a nuclear power plant and have always said that if the worst happened and I were exposed to a lethal amount of radiation, I would end my own life rather than suffer something like that. I work the midnight shift at a gas station, and I have for quite a while at various stations in different areas with varying levels of criminal activity. I have regulars, of course. I am a small-statured woman, as is my partner the other half of the week, and we have always worked together, so these regulars often worry about us and keep watch on creepy occurrences when they can. One man who worked in the metro an hour away stopped in every morning for his cigarettes. He never smiled or seemed friendly, and, as I often do, I tried to think of something that might make him smile one day. It took many months, but I finally managed by having his cigarettes ready on the counter, already scanned, for him to pay as he walked in. He smiled and then asked me, "Do you ever get scared on the night shift? You small girl, is not safe." I said I sometimes did, but we could lock the doors and hide if we had to, and the provincial police, think state troopers, if you are American, had a station close by and often stopped in to get their highway vehicles washed. I had a good rapport with those officers. He nodded and then told me a story about when he first moved to our country from Eastern Europe with his wife and child back in the late 80s, early 90s. He fell asleep at work one night at the gas station where he worked midnights. When he woke up, the phone had been ringing for hours and his manager was shaking him violently, asking if he was all right. He was fine, he said, and apologized for falling asleep. His manager screamed that it was fine, he had dozed off, and told him to look outside. All of their motor oil was missing, and the exterior of the place was a mess. Thieves had come, grabbed all the oil, and left him be because he slept through the entire thing, then moved down the road to the next station. There, the clerk was awake and fought back, so the thieves stabbed him to death and left him to bleed out. When he finished telling me this, he concluded with, "If you ever feel sleepy, just lock the door and do it, it might save your life." I do not work at that station anymore, but I think about that guy all the time and wonder how his grandkids are. This happened back in 2023. A work colleague was off for a long time, totally unlike him. When he finally returned, we found out his friend had had his life taken by a group of soccer idiots. They had been in a pub watching a match for their team and were celebrating a win when a group of men who supported the opposing side got angry and started arguing. When my colleague and his friends left the pub, those men jumped his friend and beat him so badly that he ended up in the hospital, where he eventually succumbed to his injuries. This is one of the reasons I hate football, especially here in England. Riot vans and hundreds of police are always around every train station and football stadium. Sad little men willing to take a life over a bag of air getting kicked around. It is not the first time, and certainly will not be the last, that someone has died over football. When I was about 18, my friend and I went to the movies and then decided to walk home. It was a bit of a walk, but we didn't want to pay for a cab. I'm always pretty vigilant when walking, especially at night, so I noticed a guy with his hood up behind us. Every so often I'd look over my shoulder to check on him. He started pretty far back but was gaining ground weirdly fast. The last time I turned my head, I caught him sprinting at us. I panicked and told my friend to run for it. She's in those Birkenstock slip-on sandals that were popular then, and she's struggling to run, so I'm dragging her until we get to a gas station. I bang on the window and beg the clerk to let us in, but he says he can't because it's past a certain time at night, though he promises if the guy comes near us he'll call the cops. The guy comes down the hill, through the gas station, staring at us the whole time. I swear the only reason he backed off was because the clerk had the phone visibly in his hand, plus he was a big guy. I completely broke down after he left. Just the thought that he was running at us while my back was turned scares the shit out of me. What if I hadn't turned when I did that last time? The survival story of Jeffrey Prescott. Jeffrey Prescott was on a hike across the Mara Mountains with two others, Noel Smith and Mick Hyatt. While walking along the edge of an extinct volcano, Prescott fell an unknown number of feet into the crater of the volcano. He lay there unconscious while his companions trekked down to him. Smith and Hyatt decided to go for help at a nearby village, but it would take them at least a week, which Prescott knew was far too long. With temperatures exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit and only a few pints of water, Prescott was certain he would perish before the others returned. While he waited, a small fire burned up his medical supplies and food, and Prescott had to drag himself away from the blaze. He remained there for 2 days and nights and then dragged himself farther into the crater, hoping he could find water. At about 10 a.m. on the fourth day, Hyatt miraculously arrived with some medical experts. He had reached the village in only 3 days and had returned almost immediately via horseback and a jeep. Prescott was immensely relieved and drank 2 quarts of water before being driven to a hospital on a stretcher. At the hospital, they discovered that his injuries included a cracked skull, a broken wrist, several smashed vertebrae, and torn ligaments in his knee, and he had survived all that while on the road to the hospital. Prescott was inspired to study nursing after this ordeal, and, as he said, his own miraculous survival convinced him to help others face, and defeat, death. A few years back I went out to the Blue Martini in Tampa with a girlfriend because we just wanted to get dressed up and dance a bit. I ordered one small drink and nursed it the whole time we were there. I had just finished dancing and needed the ladies' room. When I came out, she was gone, and sitting at the table with my purse and my drink were the 2 guys we had been dancing with. They told me she said she had to leave and that they would see me out. I tried calling her and she would not answer. It came out later that she was annoyed because the guy dancing with me had turned her down and she felt rejected, for fuck's sake. I felt relatively safe because we had been dancing with these guys almost all night and had spent a lot of time with them. Like the innocent, naive girl I was, I took 2, maybe more, sips of my drink but did not finish it. I was not drunk, at least I was not then. I remember telling them goodnight and refusing their offer to escort me to my car. The next thing I remember was waking up to the security guard who saved me, a man I hope has been blessed since that day. He said he had watched me come down the escalator and saw the 2 men close behind and got a very bad feeling, so he followed us. When they realized he was following them, they drifted away and he watched me get into my car. Apparently I locked the door and zonked out. Whatever they had slipped into my drink worked in that brief walk from the top of the escalator to my car door. He said he waited until they drove off and then decided to check on me. When he knocked on the window and I spoke gibberish, he knew something was off, either I was drunk or drugged. The police came and asked me for details about the men. I felt sick, like I was in an oven, and, I am sorry, I projectile vomited right there. They had drugged me. They were planning to hurt me, but that hero, that sweet young man who kept an eye out, thank God, saved me. When the gravity of it all hit me, I went back another day to hug and thank him. He politely told me, "No ma'am, it was nothing. I have a mom and 2 sisters and I would want someone to protect them too." A robbery happened at my place, but what scares me is the way it happened. I lived in a basement suite with my younger brother in a quiet neighborhood. The entire front of the house was exposed to the sidewalk, but the sides and back were covered with fenced trees. The only way to see into the basement was through a small window in my bedroom, about 5 feet from my bed. While I was out, I got word that my place had been robbed. The robbers went through the basement suite door in the back, kicked it open, then headed upstairs after robbing the basement. They just happened to break in during a 30-minute window when my brother, the upstairs tenants, and I were all out. This means they had been watching us for a couple of days and monitoring our patterns. What scares me is not really the robbery itself, but the image of me sleeping while a robber presses his face against the window 5 feet from my bed, just watching me. Up to this day, I'm still looking for a logical explanation for this. This happened in 2003. So my ex and I were checked in at a coastal resort where the cottages were far apart, about 200 meters away. Around 11 to 11:30 p.m., while we were both drinking beer with the lights turned off and only the TV on, the doorknob suddenly rattled violently, as if someone was forcibly trying to open it. There was no double lock on the door, so my first reaction was to jump from the bed and block it with my weight. The force of my landing must have been heard from the other side, but the twisting of the doorknob continued. By this time I was already pressing my face to the floor, trying to estimate how many people were outside the door through the small gap between the floor and the bottom of the door. There was nothing, not one pair of feet or anything, but the doorknob just kept rattling. I should point out that the gap was large enough for me to see outside, or at least notice any change in shadow or light caused by movement, but there was nothing. The turning of the doorknob then stopped, but I never heard any footsteps or any other noise. After waiting a few minutes, I opened the door. Everything was quiet, no footprints outside or on the sand surrounding the cottage. We just noped out of there immediately. My scariest experience was in 2013. I was driving about 40 or 50 feet behind a red truck at midnight on a long bridge that peaks in the middle, about 3/4 of a mile on either side. The roads beyond are another straight mile with no branches. From the bridge's midpoint you can see roughly 2 miles in either direction. I was following the truck, just jamming to music, headed home from a girlfriend's house. Right before the truck crested the peak, I got a weird gut feeling, like being on a roller coaster. The truck passed the peak, and from my angle you can't see anything past that point until you crest it yourself. About 4 or 5 seconds later I reached the top, and the truck was completely gone. I looked down the long stretch and there wasn't a single vehicle. Even if it had been a Bugatti flooring it, it couldn't have disappeared from view that fast. I tried searching whether a red truck had ever driven off that bridge but found nothing. To this day I'm still puzzled, yet I clearly remember that red Ford Ranger. Every orphan source report from the IAEA is terrifying and well documented with pictures. One of the most horrifying incidents is the Goiânia accident of 1987. For those who do not know, an orphan source accident occurs when radioactive material that had been lost, usually from an abandoned hospital, is discovered by people unaware of the danger, who inadvertently expose themselves and others to lethal or permanently disfiguring doses of radiation. You read in horror as survivors describe inviting neighbors to see the oddity they found and sharing samples, children playing with the sparkly dust, all unaware that they have just doomed themselves. Acute radiation exposure is a truly nightmarish way to die. You deteriorate in pain in the hospital until you die from infection or necrosis. The Therac 25 accidents. To summarize, at least 6 people were fatally irradiated by a teletherapy machine designed to treat tumors because the software that controlled it was buggy and the hardware was built without safety interlocks. The heart of the machine was a linear accelerator that fired a beam of electrons like the gun in an old-fashioned TV tube. A rotating head could select either scan coils, again, like in a TV tube, to sweep a relatively low-energy electron beam over an area, a tungsten target to convert a much more powerful electron beam into X-rays, or a mirror to show where the beam would land. Spreading the beam with magnets is the opposite of focusing sunlight with a magnifying glass. If the beam stayed still it would burn tissue very quickly, and at full power the beam produces only a tiny amount of X-rays because the target is so thick. In earlier versions everything was set manually with switches and variacs, and microswitches on the locking plunger for the head would trip a breaker if you tried to fire the linac in the wrong position. For the upgraded version the control system was replaced by a modern computer for the day, a PDP-1123 with 32 kilobytes of RAM, roughly the power of a basic Core i5 Office desktop today. Because they assumed the computer would handle everything, they left out hardware safety interlocks. The computer would know the head's position and enable only the appropriate beam current. However, software bugs let the two drift out of sync, and a race condition between the user interface code and the real-time operating system meant it could miss an update if you made an entry mistake, deleted it, corrected it, and then saved. Practically, this meant it could set the power supply for X-ray current, taps wide open, flat out, with the scan coils on, or electron therapy current, restricted but still dangerous, with the targeting mirror in place. Worse, if the sensor measuring electron power was severely overloaded, it could report a low or zero dose. The software and hardware did perform many checks and often halted treatment with cryptic errors when something was not aimed or tightened properly, so staff believed the claim that it was practically impossible to overdose a patient. It was not correct. If you write software for anything, even a simple LED blinking project, think about Therac 25 and ask yourself whether there are any combinations of circumstances you have not yet considered that might cause a serious problem. This is a story my mom tells me all the time. When I was not even 6 months old, my dad was out of town on a work trip and my mom was home alone with me and my older brother. The house was somewhat isolated and had a gravel driveway with a sensor doorbell that rang whenever someone walked or drove close to the garage. At 11:30 p.m. my mom heard the chime and woke up. She knew my dad was not due home for 2 more days, so she was sure it was not him. She grabbed a shotgun and sat in the hallway that led to the front door. Someone jiggled the handle, and my mom loudly pumped the shotgun and told the person she was aiming it at the door. Then she heard the chime again and footsteps running down the driveway. That was it. The next day she heard sirens was past the house toward the neighbor's place. They had been found lifeless in their bed. The police assumed the intruder had stopped by our house either before or after taking our neighbors' lives. I was 15, a friend and I were walking along the canal. We had walked several miles, about 90 minutes at a normal pace. We reached an area known for being family-oriented, with picnic benches around and a pub on the opposite bank, well populated at midday. After about 30 minutes there, and just before leaving, I asked a man I had seen smoking if I could borrow his lighter. He obliged. I lit my cigarette, handed it back, and my friend and I set off toward our local area. After about 15 minutes, we noticed the man was behind us. We did not think much of it, but there was a path that ran parallel, so we cut through some light trees and bushes and walked along that for a bit. The man did the same. We swapped between the main path and the canal path a few times, each time, so did he. We knew that if we sped up, we could cut the journey back home to 30 minutes. Up ahead there was an option to leave the canal path for the main road, but at that time of day it would have little traffic and it was not a great area, so we continued. With about a mile left, the man was still switching paths whenever we did, and we knew the parallel path would end where we planned to leave the canal. To exit, we had to move onto the canal path, go under a bridge, make an immediate U-turn, head up the slope to the bridge, and cross it. Beyond that lay dense woods and bushes. We devised a plan. Stay on the main path until the last second, cut to the canal path, run under, up, and over the bridge, then split up on either side in the woods and hope he did not see us. Everything worked as planned. While we crouched behind bushes and trees, we saw the man standing in the middle of the bridge, looking toward the direction he expected us to go, the way we had come from, and the spot where we were hidden. After what felt like the longest 5 minutes, he left the bridge. My friend and I stayed along the tree line, hidden from the bridge, until we were far enough up the path to sprint to the main road. I still have no idea what that guy wanted, but I have never walked along the canal again. I was forgetful and just plain absent-minded. I started college and locked myself out of the car for the millionth time. I did not want to call my dad for obvious reasons. I am a tool. I realized my phone was also in my backpack in the car. No problem, I could head into school and call. A man in his vehicle saw me and offered to call someone for me. He dialed the number and just looked at me, and I became keenly aware of the L-shaped lot I was in and how I was at the back with only one way out. He looked over and I saw 2 other guys walking toward us. He was clearly on the phone with one of them. I said, "Wrong number, hey." And he smirked. My brain was raging at my stupidity. By the grace of God I saw a familiar vehicle flash its lights. It was my dad. I had also forgotten my laptop charger. He had been trying to call me and thought, I bet my silly kid locked herself out while going to pay for her parking ticket. I started bawling. I moved to get away and one of the guys stepped into my path. My dad rolled up about 6 inches from hitting the 2 men on foot, rolled down the window, and started describing them aloud. 2 Caucasian men, both wearing blue sweaters, 3rd man in truck. They were scared and scrambled toward the truck, but there was still only one way out. I jumped in my dad's car. Literally seconds later a campus officer came by. The girl who had been with me grabbing the ticket noticed I was not walking behind her afterward and asked them to see if I needed help. I do not know what type of guardian angel situation that was, but I was so grateful.